Welcome to episode 184 of Silver Lining for Learning. My name is Punya Mishra, and I'm here with my co-hosts Chris Didi from Harvard, Young Zhao from Kansas and Melbourne, and Kurt Bong from Indiana, who is right now, where are you, Kurt?
Kurt, you're muted.
Oregon.
I'm muted. The Oregon West Coast.
The Oregon West Coast. So Zhao and Kurt are actually on the same time zone for a change. So I'm really excited about today's show. As I was thinking about this, I was reminded of this quote from Winston Churchill where he said that we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. And I think that we often don't think about, when we are talking about education and learning, we spend a lot of time talking about the what and the how. What should we be teaching? That's like, you can see all the controversies around CRT and this and that and how we should teach math. And, so the what and the how get a lot of attention. But in some ways, we spend far less time talking about the where. Where is that learning to happen? Because the design of that where, of that space is, even though we sort of take it for granted, it constrains and liberates us in many, many different ways, right? It can change the nature of interaction and the learning that can happen in that space. So, if even I was just thinking of this morning, like if you think of a classroom, what do you imagine? You imagine a box with chairs lined up, a teacher's desk at the front. And, that structure itself tells you a lot about the nature of power and distribution of power in that space. Like who has it, who does not, who tells, who has the voice and who has to get permission in order to speak. So what if we thought about space differently? And so I'm really excited to have our guests today who have been doing some amazing work in this space, no pun intended. Our guests are Prakash Nair and Dr. Parul Minhas from Education Design International. I will let them introduce themselves, but Prakash, just briefly, is a futurist and visionary architect who is recognized globally for his contribution to school design. He has a couple of books out there, or more than a couple of books out there. And Dr. Minhas is EDI's Director of Research and Digital Innovation. In her work with collaboration with Prakash has led to many influential studies and tools that assist the design of educational excellence. So okay, Zhao, there is another overlap that I should mention. Prakash and you and I all overlapped at Urbana-Champaign, though I don't think at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of a Midwest connection there. So with this, we are really here to talk to you, so I should stop. And I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself briefly and maybe tell us the path that got you to this, because it's not everybody who's working, even architects working in the space of education. And I know, Parul, your path has been even more interesting, I think, and zigzag to get to where you are. So why don't I start with you, Prakash? Briefly introduce yourself, how you got here, and what are some of the ideas that animate your thinking? We'll keep that brief, and then we'll just open it up for Q&A after that.
Yeah, well, I got here through the public sector. I worked in New York City government in the largest school construction program in the world. We were spending an average of $1 billion every year on school construction. At the end of 10 years, we had made no difference to education, despite having built 100 spanking new schools, which won many design awards, by the way. And that was a shock to me. How could we spend $10 billion and not affect the bottom line of education, which is education, None of the measures of education had improved in New York City over those 10 years. And so I literally took a sabbatical, went to work for a technology company, putting laptops in schools. And I was shocked to see the tremendous ways in which one laptop in a child's hands can completely change the education paradigm, where the teacher ceases to be the font of all knowledge. And I was thinking to myself that if a laptop can make that much of a difference, how much of a bigger difference can an entire building make? So I brought that paradigm back, started my own company with the idea that a building should do more than just, keep kids warm and dry, but also be the instrument, just like the laptop, a change agent to change the entire paradigm of education itself. And that's the model that I put out there, hoping there'd be a market for it. And sure enough, now we are in 58 countries on 6 continents. So clearly there must be some hunger for this new way of thinking, So that's kind of my story.
Thank you, Prakash. Parul?
Yes. So I was an assistant professor at an architecture college, and also a very passionate mother to a toddler. So I had a great bond with my students in particular, and I was not, I wasn't given the salary of a counselor, but I was unofficially the counselor of my architecture school there. And I had one student in front of me and another one waiting outside, and they would come and share all sorts of their stories and their issues. And I was terrified to see how many mental health issues are our youngsters going through, anxiety, depression, and whatnot. And what the common thing I saw was, to the same challenges, if one child in the same environment, with the same challenge, if one child was thriving, the other one was really struggling. So I could see that the roots were somewhere in their childhood. And getting worried about my own child, I started reading a lot about child psychology and how children perceive their world, and how how are they affected by their environment. So being an architect helped me take that to another level as well. So when it came to start my doctoral research, I started with talking about psychological well-being of children in school environments. And that was a huge eye-opener for me, to see how little children, when we put them in those square boxes, as you said, how their curiosity, how their natural tendencies were hampered, and how those children were raised into altogether different adults, much away from their own natural alignment. So that the whole research was, it was a hell of a journey, because I dived into neuroscience and psychology and all the related disciplines to find out, what is actually affecting children at every level possible, and how then the environment part could fit in. That's when I found Mr. Nair's books very helpful in that journey. And I was like, okay, if schools were actually the way what he's talking about, because at that time, that's what I was kind of concluding, that if the schools were very collaborative and actually nurturing a child's natural tendencies, children would have been much more different than what they grow up to be. And when I contacted him, I was thrilled to see that he is actually creating those kind of schools. So that was an immediate connection, and I was fortunate enough to work with him. And also he kind of welcomed me in his team, and that's where we began. And it's been exciting ever since.
Cool. So I know there'll be other questions coming up from the others, but as a sort of startup, can you talk about certain core ideas that underlie your thinking about designing schools? Maybe each of you can speak a little bit about what are sort of the deeper ideas that you always have in mind. Those are sort of like your sort of North Star, your compass, right? That these are certain things that are maybe lacking in existing designs, or even if they do exist, they're not foregrounded the way they should be. And so maybe and may an example or two from each of you, and then we'll just open it up for questions. Chris, I know, is already ready to jump in.
Yeah, okay. So here's the deal. Punya, you talked about Winston Churchill's quote, right? First we shape our buildings and then they shape us. So if that's an inevitability, what I was thinking, one of the things that really shaped our practice is this: do we really want our buildings to shape our kids? I mean, do I want a building designed in 2023 to shape my children in 2050? I don't even know what 2050 is going to be like. And now I have built something that is inevitably going to shape them. I don't want that. I want to get away from the Winston Churchill quote. How do I do that? And the only way I can do that is to make what we call a living building, a learning building, a building that learns along with you, so that it changes and morphs as time goes by. So we think of buildings as static places. And I'm saying, no, it shouldn't be. We need to give our occupants the opportunity to reshape the buildings throughout its history, just as the children and evolves and society evolves, so should buildings. They should not be these monuments that continue to shape people way beyond their useful life. So that was one thing that shaped my way of thinking. The other is this notion that in education, you cannot start with the other very famous line, which is form follows function. In most cases, that would work because if we know the function, then we build the form around that function. But in education, the function is determined by the form. So if form follows function, you're inevitably going to have the exact same form over and over and over again, and we're going to repeat history. So we don't want form following function in buildings. We want form and function to be designed collaterally together so that you create a brand new system in which form and function are completely integrated. Right now, we have an integrated form and function, which is representative of the industrial age. We want a completely different system where form and function are designed together, hand in hand. So those were the two drivers behind our practice.
Oh, that I love both of those because they resonate very deeply, personally speaking, with me. So, Parul, what about you? What were some guiding principles that sort of drove you?
Yes, for me, when I began, the first theory that came my way was called the self-determination theory, which I would say is the very, it leads to what we know today as self-directed learning. So self-determination theory talks about three basic psychological needs of all humans, which are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So when I read this in the context of children, that children need autonomy, and we rarely think about autonomy when we talk about children, because since the time they're born and they go to school and they graduate, they have very little autonomy in their lives. They're kind of bossed around by adults all through until they become teenagers and start, then we say that they're getting rebellious or whatever. So when I go to a space now, I see how much autonomy does a child have here. So autonomy does not mean that the child is just running around or creating chaos or doing whatever, but autonomy necessarily means how much psychologically free is the child to do the way he or she likes, right? The psychological freedom. And how competent is the environment making him feel? How can he navigate the environment how much of the environment can the child navigate by himself without adult assistance? And relatedness is how much sense of belonging does that space generate for the child? How much does he feel that, okay, this is my space, and now I am, these when these three needs are fulfilled, then the child is totally aligned with their natural state, and that's when they actually get ready to learn. So I always say well-being before learning. So when you get the child ready, prepped up, learning happens naturally. So that's how our spaces can offer these psychological needs as well.
Thank you, Parul. And I'm thinking back to most schools in India do not subscribe to that and these perspectives
Yes.
at all, if at all, or in a very minimal kind of way. I know, Chris, you have some
Absolutely.
questions, so go right ahead.
Well, I have three things I want to talk about, but I want to spread them out so that we can have a conversation. So I'm going to build on what you were saying, Parul, as the first, and then I'll try to jump back in later with each of the others. So I did some work with a school district that had substantial resources, and they decided that they wanted to reconfigure some of their existing schools in terms of space. And one thing that they did is they asked the students, what kind of space would you like to see? And I thought that there were two interesting answers. One of them was that the students said, we want some spaces that are like Starbucks, that are like coffee houses, because people come to coffee houses and now you see banks offering these kinds of spaces, hotels offering these kinds of spaces in their lobby. They're sort of individual work, collaborative work, some kind of refreshments to keep your engagement high. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that they said, which I thought was even more interesting, they said, we want to use the floor. They said, we want to lie on the floor. Now the teachers said, oh my God, the students are going to lie on the floor and go to sleep. But actually what they found is that there was a subset of students who really felt that they thought better when they weren't sitting in a chair, especially a school chair, and who would actively participate, lying on the floor, putting their feet on the wall, adopting all these weird positions that kids do. So I'm curious both about whether you have asked students and what kind of answers you received, and also whether either of these suggestions that the student had resonates with you in terms of your work and thinking.
Parul, you may want to address that. You just did some teacher-student workshops.
Yeah, and before that, I want to say that the first picture that I saw of an EDI school, the most interesting aspect I saw was there was a child literally lying down over a couch, upside down, and reading a book. And I was like, wow, that's a school. I mean, they were all over the place, sitting in groups, lying on floor, one sitting in the couch. I was like, wow, if that was a school, I would just love to be a part of it, because that very organization gives the sense of freedom. So if I have to, one given is, okay, you are here to study. If I'm here to study, can I do it the way I want? So that's, you can decide to what extent are you allowing the child freedom. But they do feel psychologically free to sit anywhere in any posture, and they're definitely going to perform much better. So recently we were at American School of Doha for a discovery visit. So during our discovery visit, we talk to teachers, we talk to students, and we have them design their dream school and then present their designs. And oh my God, what kind of interesting solutions and proposals they come with. It's very interesting. So one of these students, he said, we should have an area for esports in the school. So if I grow up and I want to take esports as a career option, it should start right in the school. So they have all sorts of ideas which are beyond, an architect's or an educator's comprehension, that, if we can even think that way. But I think with all sorts of information coming in, and when they are allowed to explore various fields. So one of the students said, our school has a huge musician population. How about having a piano at the entrance? So somebody could just, somebody who's proficient can sit there and play, and others can enjoy. And the other child said that my music room looks like a zoo. I don't want to be seen while I'm practicing. So children definitely do not need a standardized space. They have diverse needs, and we need to give them a variety of spaces so that they can actually work, learn, and experience according to their natural tendencies, and not the way we think they must. Yes.
Thank you. So this is actually quite interesting. I was Prakash, that conversation about a living building. It really struck me. You because I was really interested in the idea of students and teachers work with the building, and the building changes itself. I think it's. I was watching the State of the Union address. So I was wondering if Marjorie Taylor Greene and other politicians could change that building. Could change Congress. It was really interesting to watch. You look at Biden, and behind him was Kamala Harris, and I think Mac Johnson was the.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. That was designed to do that. I was thinking about the UK Parliament, about the two parties. You have a. So this kind of design is actually fascinating. I mean, that's how it defines behaviors, learning, designed with that idea of education. And that was specifically designed. I don't want to. Well, it's kind of education Congress, but it's a political system. So I was just wondering, Prakash, can you give some examples today with how students, technology, landscape, materials, furniture can be redesigned following, students different learning philosophies, educational approaches, because I think that's what you guys do the best. I think it would be very, very meaningful.
Yeah, I think the answer is actually pretty simple. People would say, since we don't know what the future looks like, how can you possibly design for the future, right? And what we say is, while we don't know what the future looks like, we know what we look like, right? As human beings, over we call these primordial learning metaphors. So if you were to narrow them down to four, Dr. David Thorberg said there's the campfire, which is we learn from an expert. There's the storyteller. There's the watering hole, where we learn from our peers, right? There's life, where we learn by doing, and then there's cave, where we learn by ourselves, where we are, assimilating all the stuff that we picked up. So these are four primordial learning modalities, and we've broadened them to 20 modalities of learning. So what we have in our schools is a variety of opportunities for these modalities of learning. So what we're saying is that a living and learning building, basically those modalities of learning will vary. So maybe maybe at some point in time, the direct instruction is predominant, and at some other point, peer tutoring is important, or peer learning is important, or independent study is important, whatever. But if you've created sufficient variety, then those 20 modalities can fluctuate to any degree, right? Depending upon the needs of the particular educator, educators, or students at that point in time. So we as architects can step back and just create buildings where those 20 modalities can continue to fluctuate over time. So you might be using different technologies, but the form, the kind of learning, whether it's a peer learning, independent learning, collaborative learning, hands-on learning, these things are not going to change. The tools might change, but the methodology doesn't change. And so it's not that difficult to design a learning building that will continue to. I mean, I have a perfect example of this. I was in American School of Bombay 10 years after I originally designed it, and the building didn't look anything like I had on the day when it was first opened. It did look completely different. And yet they hadn't spent a single dollar on construction, because the building was designed in a way that the occupants could continue to evolve and change it as needed. So that's what I'm talking about. And one last thing, you talked about Biden and the speech. The thing is that certain environments are set up for certain ways to behave. So Congress and the Parliament, these are things that they want to create a certain historic continuity, so that if you look at a speech from 50 years ago, it looks pretty much the same as today. So they're trying to continue that. But yes, maybe certain things historically we want to preserve that tradition, and maybe there are other things where we don't want to preserve that. So we need to think about that. So that tradition requires the Speaker of the House is behind, the Vice President is next to, and the President is in front, and that maybe that tradition is a good tradition. I don't know if it is good, but it requires that sort of thing, right? But what I'm saying is that why should we write that script for 50 years in the future for all children?
Thanks. That's great. And that was really what I was hoping for. Thanks, Prakash.
Thank you.
Parul, did you have anything to say before I jump in with a question?
No, please go ahead.
Prakash, I appreciate the reference to David Thornburg. It's been a while since I've seen him. Interesting character. Parul, I'm doing research on SDL, self-directed learning, so I found your comments quite interesting. You might want to, I can send you some of our work in the past year. We've got an article of 15 guidelines for self-directed learning in the Open Learning Journal. We've got an article, a review of ECNU Review of Education, 10 years review of my research. We've got an article in George Mason University's kind of a new journal they're creating on a checklist for self-directed learning, 24-item checklist. And in distance education, we have a systematic review of the research. Or might they be inspired? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I think since it is a very recent work, the book that we've recently published is a great resource on the upcoming trends, and also on what drives us as, yes, you can see this book. It's called A New Language of School Design, and it is freely available in the PDF format on our website, educationdesign.com. And it has all the I usually call myself a bridge. Like I do research in neuroscience, in positive psychology, in behavioral economics and similar fields and bring whatever best I can to the field of school design. And here I'm guided by Mr. Nair to put those ideas into practice, like how research from neuroscience can actually be incorporated in the favor of children and their well-being in schools. So we've kind of translated all these theories and picked up latest research from these fields and put that into actionable ways in which it can be implemented in school design and learning design as well. So I would say you should please take a look at our book and feel free to contact us if there's anything we can help you with.
And as far as conferences go, there's an annual conference by the Association for Learning Environments, which is our industry association. And it's going to be in Oregon this year, actually, in October. So that's definitely a good forum to hear some of the latest thinking from our industry, And educators are there as well, not just architects.
So we're in Oregon, will it be? And can you hold up the book for us again? So after you speak, get on camera. I want to get you on camera, so you have to say a few words first.
Yeah, so this is called a new language of school design. We say a new language because what we're saying is that we as architects need to acquaint ourselves with a new vocabulary, the words that Parul was talking about: salutigenic design, self-determination theory, choice architecture, and that neuro architecture. That these are elements that we need to incorporate into the work that we do, because there's tons of research from in other areas, but hasn't filtered into the school design arena yet. So as we as architects need to acquaint ourselves, so do educators. So that's why we call it a new language.
I'll take it to what Punya said in the beginning, that there has been a lot of work and a lot of talk about what of learning, but there's rarely anything about where of learning. So this book, we've tried to put together everything about where of learning. So
it's in Portland, Oregon, and you can show A4LE is the number 4, LE.org, and you can just look at the annual conference. It's in Portland.
Learningscapes, yeah.
Learningscapes 2024, yeah.
So I'm going to jump in with my second theme here. I have a colleague, Daniel Wilson at Harvard, who for years ran every summer a workshop that was co-sponsored by the Graduate School of Education and the Graduate School of Design. And it was called LEFT, Learning Environments for Tomorrow. People came up with lots of interesting designs. Both the leaders of the workshop and the participants came in with lots of designs that they had seen locally. And I participated one year, and I think I threw everybody because I was 2 standard deviations away from the standard presentation, because I talked about blending physical space and virtual space. So I've done a lot of work in XR, VR, AR, MR, and I've seen attempts to do this, but the attempts, it seems to me, have not been very useful. So during the pandemic, one of my colleagues, Russ Gant, used the LiDAR technology that the real estate industry developed to scan the interior of like 60 Harvard buildings, which these days can be done with an iPhone. Mm-hmm. And he came up with these very elaborate interior maps. And then the pandemic ended, and I don't know that they were ever used for anything. And all of us have seen virtual campuses, mm-hmm. where you are replicating the physical world inside of the virtual world. And those don't seem to have gone anywhere either. So I'm curious if you would agree first that mirroring the physical world and the virtual world doesn't seem to add a lot. Mm-hmm. And second, what ideas you have about things that might be a good way of melding virtual space and physical space.
That's an excellent question. I think we have to address the elephant in the room first to get there, because we have 4 or 5 steps behind where I know where you want us to be, Chris, and that is that our mental model of school and how we perceive education to be, and this notion that, and as I said, the elephant in the room is the classroom, right? Because the classroom represents everything that we think learning is, because everybody's been in classrooms. And my point is, why do we have classrooms? There's no architectural justification for a classroom. There was no education justification for a classroom, because sorting kids by age and putting them in a group and then having one adult somehow magically teach them, there's absolutely no research that says that that's at all effective, which is why homeschool parents on average have about an hour of formal education, and the rest of them kids are sponges. They are learning all the time, right? So this notion that learning spaces have to look a particular way, so we have to get rid of that notion. So the pandemic is a perfect example of that, this obsession with the classroom, because they try to duplicate the classroom in the virtual world where there was absolutely no reason to do that, right? And yet we tried to duplicate it. We had 20 kids sitting in a virtual classroom, which there was an absurd proposition to start with, and of course
Half
it
of them
failed.
sleeping.
Yeah, and it failed because the only reason the kids are sitting there is because we're forcing them to. The minute they're not forced to, they'll put a loop of themselves on the video, and the teacher thinks, and they're playing video games or whatever, and then the teacher thinks they're in the classroom. So my point is that before we can get into the virtual world, virtual spaces, we first have to get rid of this notion that a classroom is somehow has this sort of almost exalted status. And in fact, we even use the word outdoor classroom, right? Which makes absolutely no sense. If you're outdoors, by definition, you're not in a classroom. We have homeschool, which makes no sense at all, because if you're in home, you're not in school, right? So this obsession that we all have, which we may not even realize, it's a huge thing that it's the biggest lie in the world, and so it's easy to sell, right? So when we talk about virtual spaces, what we are trying to do is duplicate experiences. We are trying to say, what is the best way for a child to have an experience? So if a pilot can have the experience of flying a plane in a simulator, and then you're brave enough to put him in an actual plane, there's no reason that children cannot have simulated experiences in school that model experiences that we might not be able to afford for them to have. I would obviously prefer a kid to be walking in a garden in a forest, whenever that's possible. But if it's snowing outside, hey, the kid can still walk in that forest, So I would say that we need to try to take full advantage of this virtual reality, immersive reality, so that kids can get experiences that they would otherwise not be able to get when that practical experience is not physically possible. A kid sitting in a city might not have the opportunity to, as I said, walk to climb a mountain. So give him that opportunity, give her that opportunity, that sort of thing,
And also, I would like to add something to this, that when we are creating experiences for children, research in neuroscience has proved that whatever you're feeling or visualizing in your mind, your body is actually, physically manifesting the impacts of it. So if we are able to, that's why we say that it's most potent to work on the experiential part. So whatever the child is experiencing in the mind, whether that's, if we can do that better for them by the way of virtual reality, then we should do that.
Yeah, I just as a follow on, so I've done some things with augmented reality that I think are interesting. One of the things is that we had a project called EcoMobile, and with EcoMobile, we took a neighboring pond and we augmented it so that with a tablet or a cell phone, you could walk around, you could geotag things that would be triggered, that would provide information about what you were seeing. Students could find new things, like they found a snake skin, and then that becomes part of the augmented reality. So they're co-designers. And we published a lot about that. It was a valuable thing. And templates can be developed for augmented realities like that. But the problem is that they're intrinsically local. And so somebody, like a teacher, has to take the template, go out to the local environment that matches it on whatever, and set up all the tagging and things, which is a substantial investment. We also experimented with location independent augmented reality, which is much simpler, but of course it doesn't draw on the location in the same way. We had a little experience called Alien Contact, in which it turned out that aliens had landed outside of your middle school, but they were invisible. And you could only see them through the camera of your phone, and you could only see them if you were the age of a middle school student. And we had a math curriculum that was based around finding these alien artifacts and needing to understand the proportions of the artifact to know what kind of vessel the aliens were traveling in and whether they wanted trade or whether they wanted war. And we also did some interesting work in English, because it turns out that the aliens had last come 2,000 years ago. And so they spoke Latin. And so the students were learning Latin, the Latin words that underlie a lot of English words without realizing it, because they were so excited about speaking alien. And then just one more example inside of the school, which requires a different kind of AR, because you're not able to use GPS. Schools can be set up for simulation, as you talked about. So we had a contagion example that we never actually got around to implementing, where there was an outbreak of some kind of disease within the school. This was before the pandemic. And the school became isolated. No one could go in or out. And the cafeteria became the infirmary, and the principal's office became, like the headquarters, and the different rooms that had different configurations naturally mapped into this kind of contagion scenario. And the kids, found that exciting, because it was more fun really in the physical space than the virtual space. So I think there's some creativity that's possible here that we're just not taking advantage of. And I'm curious as to your thoughts about that.
Well, as I said, I want to let the others talk and ask some questions. But the bottom line to this is that we need to, the adults in the room need to get past our mental blocks. And if we do, then any space can become an amazing teaching space. As I said, I think that we can, we talk about place-based learning, which to me is critical, because if you want to learn about the grocery store, you should be in the grocery store, how that functions. If you want to be in an airport, be in an airport. So it's a lot easier to teach about a particular field or, a subject if you are surrounded by all the artifacts of that particular field, right? But the virtual world allows us to duplicate that in the confines of the school building. And so that allows learning to become much more authentic than it is now, because now it's a representation of reality that children are expected to then take back into the real world. And that representation is often so far from reality that it serves no purpose at all. That's why kids come out and the real world is a shockingly different experience than what they had in school, the formulas that they learned in school, and we want to make that less of a culture shock when they leave school,
Parul, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm good.
So I want to build on something, Prakash, that you talked about, and I'd love to get both of your takes on this. So this idea that, there are these assumptions that have been made about what learning should be, can be, and that's sort of what I talk about in my 5 spaces for design in education, that, we are, and this emphasis, Parul, that you talked about experience, that how are we designing an authentic experience, even though it might be in a sort of an artificial setting or something that way. But one of the bigger constraints when you're thinking about this idea of design is this broader systems and culture within which whatever you design as an architect, those spaces and that you've created, which is the system and culture of education and those blinkers that we have. And so I wanted to talk, both of you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of that, because even though you might design a very powerful space, but if the culture of education, broadly speaking, or the leadership within that school don't necessarily buy into it, they are going to find ways of subverting the design. So I mean, you have these schools where I've seen where, the idea was it would be like open so that you could look across classrooms with sliding walls, and nobody ever slides those walls. If there are glass walls, people put posters on it so that their classroom can feel isolated, because they want control over their own space and they don't want the others to look in. So these are ways of subverting what are very egalitarian sort of, ideals that have been built into that. So I want you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you face there, right? That you might design a school, the conversations might be very productive, you might have learned to listen to the students, but at the end of the day, what are the other sort of constraining factors that determine how that space actually gets used? Either of you can jump in.
Yeah, so I think, my colleague Heidi Hayes Jacobs has said that there are 4 components that need to change if you want any kind of meaningful change. One is the way we organize children. The other is the way we organize teachers. The other is the way we organize schedules. And the other is the way we organize space, right? So I think what's happened in education is that all of these, because of the siloed nature of education, changes happen in one dimension. In the curriculum, for example, or professional development, or pedagogy, or schedule. We do block schedule. Oh, let's go to block schedule, But the problem is that it's a system that's broken. So you need to reform the system. And when you change those 4 pieces, you have actually created a brand new system. So the reason the things that the transparent walls don't work is because the other 3 pieces of the puzzle haven't been equally addressed. So unless we address them as a system, and I think the beauty for us is that because we are architects and we are coming in behind a ton of money, we've worked on projects as small as $20,000 or $30,000 to all the way up to $150, $200 million. So with that kind of money behind us, there's a lot of discretion in how that money gets spent. And so if you're talking about systemic change, you need to have the money behind that. You can't walk into a school tomorrow, no matter how wonderful your ideals might be, on Monday and say, hey, we're going to do things differently, because your budget's already spoken for. Whereas when you're talking about spending $100 million, guess what? If you're a school district, that's a great opportunity to rethink the entire system. So I think the failures happen because they are piecemeal, incremental, and on the edges and on the margins, as opposed to thinking big.
Parul?
Yes, I absolutely agree with this. And many a times we come across clients who claim that, okay, we are good with the learning part, we're good with the education part, we just want to change the spaces. But it's again that siloed thinking. They think that, okay, if you are space experts, you should only talk about space because we are experts in our field already.
Yeah.
But like Sugata Mitra says that he talks about Indian schools, that Indian education system is actually not, it's not failing, because it is, perfectly doing what it was meant to be doing. But the problem is the purpose of education has changed. So until and unless that part of it evolves, that mental block, as Prakash said, the adults come across that mental block, that the entire system has to change, and just changing one nut cannot, change the whole machine. You have to actually do it holistically. So that's very important here to address.
So I'm really pleased with that quote that you just said, because that's something that President Crow at ASU always says, that the system is succeeding really well. It is doing really well what it was designed to do.
Exactly.
Yes.
We perfected it over 100
intention,
years. Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
it's by intention or by happenstance, the system is working quite well. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. Kurt, I know you wanted to, you had a question or follow-up.
Yeah, I actually have 2 different questions. And the first one you might not have an answer for, and I can just jump to the second one. But I'm curious if we can humanize this a bit. if in your book or in your travels, you could talk about a testimonial or give a couple quotes that are in your book from students who have learned in different learning spaces that found them valuable. Do you have any stories of, of student personal success, enlightenment, or engagement, whatever? Would you like to share anything in that? And if not, I'll go on to the second one.
Yes. Yeah, I'll share one. This is at the Vega School in New Delhi, and I was there for a tour because it was a school that we designed along our lines. And when we got there, a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old kid received us. And we were waiting for the adults. No adults showed up. So for the first hour, they just gave us a tour of the whole school. And when they were done, they said, if you don't mind, we'd like to present our learning, what we have learned during the year. And I said, fine. So the girl, 9-year-old girl, pulled up a PowerPoint and she said, okay, this is where I started. These are the areas in which I felt I had weaknesses. And one of them was communication. And I knew I needed to improve my communication. I said, well, I think that problem, I think we've resolved. I think you've resolved that problem. And she basically said what she was there, what was the purpose of her education, what she was there to do, and explained the whole thing to me. And then I said, but do you find like school being controlling and that the adults are telling you what to do? And if you had a choice, because kids celebrate when summer holidays start, right? And are you in that same group? And she said, no. Well, I enjoy coming to school. I enjoy meeting my friends. I have a lot of freedom. I set my own agenda. And this is 9-year-old, So I think it was a lesson to me that we really underestimate children, and so that was very interesting. It wasn't a very expensive school, or the furniture wasn't that great or whatever. It was a fairly somewhat open concept. It wasn't traditional classrooms. But I was saying, if you can do that in a school in India, there's no reason this model can't thrive elsewhere. And of course, there have been many case studies like that. You wanted an example, so I'll give you that as an example.
I can recall one from we visited Anne Frank Academy last year during the Learning Escapes conference, and they had the 10th graders talk to us, and we just asked them what are their future plans and what are they aspiring to be. And I was beyond the answers were beyond my perception, honestly. One of them said that she wanted to be a lawyer because she wanted to help the children of divorced parents. And she understands that there are so many psychological issues that children come across when their parents get a divorce. So that's why she wants to study law and psychology together and help those children. And there were a group of 5 students, and all of them had very meaningful and very diverse perspectives on what they were aspiring to be. And I thought that even at 40 years of age, I could not think that deep what they were thinking at that very time. So that was super impressive for me to see.
And that was, by the way, one of our earliest schools which we designed without traditional classrooms. That school has no classrooms in traditional sense. That doesn't mean there's no direct instruction, but they're not sitting in a classroom waiting for that. Students are self-directed and have their own agendas, and teachers, they pull them out. They're pulled out into the classroom as opposed to the other way around, right? You have breakout spaces. Here, the classrooms are the breakout spaces. Because you don't start with the assumption that children need to be directed at all times,
Wonderful. I'm curious in my follow-up question, if you've got any visions in your head, any contemplations that are on paper that you haven't seen implemented yet, that you have hope for the near future to see. What are either entire designs or components of a architectural design?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Albemarle, which is a school district, very Charlottesville in that area. It is infamous for other reasons, but it was a school that wanted to build another high school. They already had 3, and comprehensive high school that would cost tens of millions of dollars. And in conversations, we suggested that maybe they shouldn't build a high school. Maybe they already have the 3 high schools with the swimming pools and the football teams and all that. Why build another one? And they said, because we have more students. We said, yeah, but why can't they have these 3 high schools as their home base? And then you do something completely different. And we thought about creating a bunch of satellite learning centers all around the community, right? So a colleague of mine, Bruce Jilk, many, many years ago said that if you fly on a plane over a community, you would see these big boulders where all the learning happens. That's the university, that's the school, that's the college, community college, et cetera, et cetera. And what he said is that that boulder should be broken down into pebbles and distributed throughout the community. So that learning isn't something that becomes one of many things that we do, right? Learning should be integrated so that the learning happens as a byproduct of other things that you do. So we are already having movie theaters, we already have shopping centers, we already have offices, we already have medical centers and sports arenas and all that. These are all amazing places for learning. So the idea of school disappears entirely. But schooling also disappears, but learning doesn't. So if we can recreate society, that's how I would do it, with no schools at all. That learning would literally be dispersed throughout the community. And this is not a utopian concept. I know in New Zealand, there was a so-called school in a high-rise, and it was called the Discovery School. And the parents would basically pick up the kids throughout the day and hang out with them because it's in the middle, it's in downtown, which is where the work happened, So the parents and the teachers co-teacher, they co-parented and co-teachered the kids, So a model like that, it would be, to me, ideal. But I think we might be a few years from that because, we've got this societal thing where children have to be in school because we have two-parent working parents. And so school becomes more of a custodial arrangement rather than a true learning space.
That reminds me of my friend Glenn Jones, who had Jones International University, who wrote a book, Make All the World a School. And I just wrote a forward to a book, basically with that title. I'm happy to send you, but yeah, I appreciate those comments. Parul, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I would add, we are actually currently working on our new publication, which is about more about how if children are we allow them to naturally align them to their their instincts and their natural systems, we probably never have to bother about their learning and teaching processes. So just like Prakash said, that if everything was put in the right space, we might not even need schools. So we're working on this, and we're talking that what are the natural aspects, or what are the natural alignments of children, of humans as children, or I may say, and how, if all those aspects are put in the right places, even if it is in the school, because if we say that it is still a utopian concept to spread it out through the community, but if you design a school and create that space that the children they just can be in their natural state, very close to their natural state, they are prepped and ready for learning. So learning starts happening there, and then you don't have to tell them to collaborate, you don't have to tell them to sit in a corner and study, you don't have to instruct them at all, but it all will flow naturally if that kind of alignment can somehow be achieved.
But you are
I'm muted again. Yeah, I appreciate the psychology, Parul. As a former educational psychologist, I guess you always are one once you were one, but I do appreciate all the comments from both of you today. I think Young has a follow-up, and I don't know if we'll have time beyond that, but it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Parul and Prakash, this is actually quite interesting because when Parul was talking about the sense learning theories about those, those basically in a positive psychologist, I was just wondering about in this new age of learning, we have seem to have generic learning theories, like, children should be the first, children should be leading, they should have autonomy, they should have voice. We have this one thing. I was very interested in the part of culture, like India, for example, is a huge diversity of history, different traditions. If you move to China, I know you did work in China. I mean, even in the US, you got 50 states, 50, and each state has so many different places. So how do you deal with the issue about in terms of culture, I mean, you were talking about the culture of the, of the U.S. Congress, for example, changes, the changeables and not changeables. I was just very quickly, what have you been thinking about that? Because I hate to say a generic learning culture that goes to every place. I think that would be a bad idea, but
yeah. No, I think I'm really glad you brought up that question, because we've had this happen with the Maori in New Zealand, where one of the elders came to me and said, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you have a Western bias in your thinking. We, for example, are storytellers. We learn in a different way. We learn very informally. So when you're designing all these formal spaces, you are not necessarily aligning with our culture, because it was a mostly indigenous school that we were working with there. And we, of course, listened to them. We did a school in the Arctic, about the Arctic Circle, where we put, the doors in places where they said that would not work. The snow would accumulate to the point where nobody would be able to get to the door. So we're learning, from different places. But ultimately, I guess the real story here is that we don't want to create a series of McDonald's. No matter how egalitarian our approach might be, there is still a bias, our own cultural bias that we're bringing to the table, right? And so if we are truly listening to people, we realize that maybe like in Israel, somebody said, why should students be independent? Why? Because our culture is that success isn't defined by how much money they have or career success, because it's a religious school. I mean, for them, learning the Torah, that's it. That's their definition of success, not money, not none of the things that you guys are talking about. So I'm saying there are extremes as well in this equation. So yes, I think it's a humbling thing, and we need to have that humility to say we're not coming in as experts, we know everything. We really need to come with an open mind and truly say that we want to meet you where you are, and to respect your culture, So.
That's why Prakash has brought in this discovery process to each and every project of ours, where the first step, we don't go and tell them anything about what we are planning to do for them, because we don't plan. We first collect all of their points of view, that who they are and what are their expectations, and from there we decipher what their culture and what their ways of learning are, and then design accordingly from there.
Thank you.
Almost at the hour, so it always goes by too fast. So I just want to thank Prakash, Parul, both of you for joining us today. I think this is the first time we got people who are working in designing, actually physically architecting spaces. So great contribution to the conversation here on Silver Lining for Learning. And do keep in touch. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a pleasure, and such a pleasure to meet all of you. Very honored to be in this august company.
Me too. Thank you so much. It's unbelievable that an hour passed by already.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me add
Chris?
my thanks to you for coming. Next week on the 16th of March, Silver Lining for Learning will be at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And this is one of two shows in which we're celebrating our 4th anniversary of Silver Lining for Learning. So we're excited about that. Two of the people who will be with us next week are Lynn Lipsmeyer from Southern Methodist University and Ariadna Tripoti from Little Bookmates, people that have been with us in the past that we're bringing back. We may also have some mystery guests, you never know. So looking forward to seeing you next week.